Hey guys, this is Randall, and in this video we'll be talking about how you create a SQL Server, analysis server, data source view. In the previous video, we looked at creating a data source. In order to make a data source view, you have to have a data source. If you made one previously, great. If not, you'll have to create one first. It's not exactly true. What happens is that when you right-click and say make a new data source view, if you haven't made a data source previously, they'll go ahead and direct you over to making a new one. This is the same wizard that you would get if you clicked on data source. That's pretty much true throughout Analysis Server. If you launch a wizard early and it's reliant on another wizard being used, it'll launch that as well. From here, it's the same as what we saw earlier in the video about creating a data source. Once the data source is made, you return back to the data source view wizard. In this case, I chose to use a data warehouse I'd already created for the publications database. It's a very simple data warehouse, but it does some examples that are kind of useful. So I'm going to go ahead and use that, putting all the tables over. By the way, actually, let me go back a bit. It may be that you don't want to bring all the tables over at first. Certainly there are times where that's true. Well, you don't have to. You can always add them later. Microsoft usually puts spaces in the name. If you don't like the spaces, you can take them out. This is a place to do it, or you can wait and do it later. If there's a particular theme to the set of tables that you've chosen, this is a good time to actually indicate that. If not, it'll just put in the name of the database you're connecting to. In the earlier versions of the data tools, Microsoft wasn't so enamored of their black and white motif, so they've now actually got rid of the color coding. In general, though, the fact table used to be colored yellow, and the other ones were with a blue color. But nowadays, you're just going to have to look at the names and perhaps notice that the arrows always move away from the fact table. One good thing to do when you first make a data source view is to verify that you can actually drill through and explore the data. If you cannot, your connection isn't working correctly, or you do not have permissions to see the data. In either case, you can't go forward until you get to a situation where you can actually see the data in your dimension and fact tables. I strongly recommend that every time that you make a data source view on a new database, you go through and just verify that you can see the data. If you can't, you need to fix that. A very common thing that happens with students is they will go through, create the data warehouse, thinking it's filled up all the tables, not realizing that some of the tables are filled and others are not. Later, when they go to make their dimensions and cubes, things don't work. That's because they didn't check at this stage. So take a few minutes and check it all out. In this example, I'm still missing a couple of dimension tables are actually a dimension table I want to add. If you didn't add it during the wizard phase, you just right click and say add or remove tables. It'll allow you to go back to the dialog window that the wizard had launched earlier and add in like the authors table. If you know more about data warehouse modeling, you know that the reason why the authors table is not linked to the fact table is because there is no dimensional key that would tie it in directly. In most cases, this means that there is some kind of indirect table in between. As an example, take a look at the dim publishers table. There is no link between fact sales and dim publishers. Not directly anyway. If you look at the title key of the dim titles table and the fact sales table, you know you'll notice that that is indeed the link between the two tables. So, the fact sales table can indirectly access the dim publishers table through dim titles. By the same token, if there's an intermediate table, the fact sales table can access the dim authors table. We just have to find the intermediate table. In this case, the intermediate table is called fact title authors. It may seem odd that it's not a dimension table, because it actually is what ties the dimensions to the fact table. But the reason for that is, as you'll notice that the relationship lines from a fact table always moves away from the table itself. In other words, the dimensional keys of the fact table always point towards the primary keys, or logical primary keys, of the dimension tables. You'll notice that under fact sales, we have three relationship lines moving away from fact sales, while in fact title authors we have two. In all cases, the relationship lines point away from the fact table. This is not true between fact sales and dim titles. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. This is not true between fact sales and dim publishers. You'll notice that from fact sales we have a line going away from the fact table, but then from dim titles we have it going to the publishers table. The fact title authors acts as a bridge table between dim authors and title authors. And this is the appropriate way to model a many-to-many relationship, such as the one between authors and titles. Or, to put it another way, one author can write many titles, but one title can be associated with many authors. To define that relationship, you need a bridge table, such as fact title authors. The relationship between dim titles and dim publishers is different. It's a one-to-many relationship. One publisher can have many titles, but one title is associated with only one publisher at a given time. The appropriate way to model that relationship would be to have two dimension tables connected together in this snowflake design, or to take the columns of dim publishers and move them actually into dim titles so that it forms a single table which represents a star design. When you go to build your dimensions, you'll be asked to select a data source view that you want to build on. Dimensions and cubes are always built upon a data source view. Each project can have more than one data source view. Let me make another one. This time, I'll connect to a different database. This screen shows up in the wizard unlike the last time we went through this wizard. The reason for this screen is that in the database I just pointed to, it has no foreign key relationships between the table. In the data warehouse pubs, DW pub sales, there were indeed foreign key constraints, and the relationship lines could be assumed by looking at the foreign key constraints and mirroring that. In the case of the new data warehouse I pointed to, Inventory Manager, there are no foreign key constraints, and as such, the wizard's asking us, would you like to guess? The choices are, if you have a dimension table with the same name as a primary key, or should I say a dimensional attribute with the same name as a primary key someplace, consider that a match. An example of that would be, as shown here in the little description and samples, if you have a orders table with a customer ID column and a customer table with a customer ID column, that should be considered a match. Sometimes people will design a database so that the attribute name or column name might be the name of another table. The example given in this, same name as destination table, order.customer is linked to customer.customerID. And the final choice would be any of these combinations. If you have a customer ID in an orders table and an ID column in the customers table, or one of these other choices, that would be a link that it would guess. If you don't wish it to make an educated guess for you, you can just uncheck the box and advance the wizard. You cannot make dimensions and you cannot make cubes without relationship lines between the dimensions and the fact tables that the cubes are based on. So although we can save our work and even build the project, on the build will say that it succeeded. It doesn't do you any good until the relationship lines are in. So if you don't let the wizard choose for you, you can just left click on a column and drag and drop to the other column that links the two tables together. You do not need a foreign key constraint in the database or data warehouse that you're pointing to in order for you to build a relationship between the two tables. This is because these represent a logical representation of the table, not the table itself. You can think of each one of these as being a select statement. And in fact, when you right click and say explore the data, you're basically just running the select statement. Data source views can also be created on something other than a data warehouse. For example, if I were to take a OLTP database, like the pubs database, I could then go ahead and add tables onto the screen. And build cubes and dimensions against it. The only problem is that the design of the original database may not be clear enough for your use in a BI solution. So at that point you may want to actually take some time to clean up the the naming conventions and other aspects. A simple thing might be that I want to go through and change the friendly name of authors to something like dim authors. Or in the column, instead of AUID, I could change the name to author ID. When you go to make a dimension later on, yep, wrong data source view. You'll notice that the friendly names are what show up in the dimension creation wizard. If you would like to do more than just change the friendly names, such as in dim authors, I might want to add the first name and last name together as a single column. I can replace the table with a name query. The name query will allow me to go ahead and specify a new SQL statement other than just selecting all the columns. From here, you can uncheck things that you don't want. You can also go through and put aliases on things. This is similar to the friendly name, but it uses a different mechanism. If you don't specify a friendly name, it'll assume that the name of the column, or in this case, the column alias, is what you want to use. And that's what will show up in the dimension wizard. If you'd like to take and modify the code directly, you can do that as well. So for here, I could say I'd like to see the author's first name plus a space. Just make sure I got a space in there. There we go. Plus the author's last name. And I'll call it author's full name. You can even do things simply as simple as changing the case of a name, like city and state, to uppercase letters. Or if you'd like to be more specific about what you're seeing, you can put aliases there too. You can change the format of your SQL statements, but be aware that this user interface doesn't maintain them. So while you may not be happy with the code that this user interface writes for you, and you can modify it, if later on you come back, you'll see that it removes whatever formatting you did on your code. So there's not a whole lot of reason to do so. You'll notice that once I've changed the table to a named query, the icon looks a little different. I can still explore the data and see the underlying data, but that makes sense, since when you explore the data on just one of these table icons, it's just running a select statement, such as select all from. You will need to identify which is the key column, so you can set a logical primary key on the query results. If you would like to have a composite primary key, just hold down the control button and left click on both columns, or all three, or all four. It's your choice. I just want one column for this example, so I'll highlight Author ID, right click and say Set as a logical primary key. This will not change anything in the underlying database that you're pointing to. It's only a logical replacement for the primary key that will be utilized in Analysis Server. Now, we'll still need to go through and draw relationship lines away from title authors to the dim authors named query. Notice that the column names don't have to be the same, but the data types do, otherwise you'll get an error message. Data types are indicated over here. In this case, author ID happens to be a string. You could go through and change all these to named queries and actually end up mimicking the data warehouse. The advantage of this is that you can pull data from a live OLTP database instead of having to go through a more formal design of the data warehouse and filling the data warehouse with data using through your ETL process. Although that does seem enticing, I would still recommend using a full data warehouse and ETL process to cleanse your data more thoroughly. While this will work on small to mid-size BI solutions, you do want to use it with caution. Well, hopefully this gives you a better understanding of how a data source view works. In the next video, we'll take a look at creating dimensions based off a data source view. Thanks for watching.